What we saw in Europe, and more specifically in England, of anti-immigration ethnic clashes, will this be the new normal for Europeans for a few decades? At least for some, because for others, maybe what we'll see are totalitarian states, and maybe even in some circumstances both things together. One thing that the Russian invasion of Ukraine did to Europeans was to occupy their attention and their minds. Because while many of them are focused on defending a democracy that never existed, the Ukrainian one, they are letting it slip by how their own countries are ceasing to be democratic. In fact, some of them are already actually dictatorships. Democracy is not just about voting, but a process much deeper than that. Of all the analysts, think tanks, government reports, and geopolitical or war sources that I follow, the worst are, in fact, the ones that come from the Europeans, because they are simply the ones who have the least sense of reality. Of course, for some Europeans, having no sense of reality, especially about this situation, is already something normal. Just look at the situation of the Portuguese, who still think they have some international relevance, when they don't even have importance within the Iberian Peninsula itself. But for countries like Germany, which has a historical tradition in strategy and geopolitics, this is surprising. The German case itself defies logic. They shut down their nuclear industry, leaving themselves dependent on Russia, only to then lose access to that Russian energy because of the war. And forget it if you think they're going to get that back. Channels that say that are outright lying, because they don't understand how the industrial process of nuclear energy works. Energy in the world is scarce, and reactivating the German nuclear sector won't be something that can be done in less than 15 or 20 years. On top of that, they don't even have any kind of plan or discussion about this today, so forget about it until 2040. This lack of sense of reality, of self-criticism, at least constructive self-criticism, because no one has corrupted European countries more than the Europeans themselves. With a bit of guilt that they supposedly deserve to pay for, in quotes, what they did back then, comes from the magical bubble they've been living in for more than 70 years. The Second World War was so devastating. The world is scarce. Energy is scarce. Energy in the world is scarce. Energy in the world is scarce. Lives. Energy in the generation. The Council of soon, but also politically and mainly psychologically, could now be outsourced to the Americans. How did the world achieve its longest period of material and immaterial growth from the 1950s to 2020? The Europeans believed that this peace, stability, and material and technological growth were the result of their superior European culture. Many people in Brazil, especially intellectuals and government officials in Itamaraty, believed the same. They bought into this idea of a superior culture. And if everyone followed the European civilizational model, then supposedly the world would be better. However, their culture, and I mean this in the broadest sense of the word, was not superior, and most importantly, it was not something that could be exported. Those who imitated Europeans got hurt, sometimes even more so. This supposed superior civilization of Europe was created only because the strong arms of the United States ensured its defense, and the evil Russians satisfied its hunger for commodities, especially energy, minerals, and food. It was a magic bubble, a glass dome that created this utopia, but it had already been wearing down internally. As it created a paternalistic state, it would take care of its population and look out for what was best for them, like a father who loves and cares for his children. Europeans are discovering, in the worst way, that the state, far from being their father, is their executioner, and that those who run the state never want what's best for the people. And as the United States grows tired of playing the role of global police and Europeans lose access to the Russians, this utopia is turning into a dystopia. At this point in the game, no, not anymore. It's more than obvious that promoting immigration to societies facing a demographic crisis not only doesn't solve the problem, but actually makes what's already bad even worse. The immigrants didn't become engineers and doctors, as was promised by Angela Merkel, the German chancellor at the time. But on top of that, they increased the cost to the European state, with social benefits to support these refugees. And on top of that, they brought an unprecedented level of crime to the continent. And here this is the point. In the 18th century United States, particularly in California, violent conflicts between the Irish and Chinese were common, as the Irish had arrived first for hard labor, in mines, construction, railroads, etc. Then the Chinese arrived in large numbers, and charging much less for their labor, American businessmen obviously preferred to hire the Chinese, which upset the Irish, many of whom had even fought in the American Civil War. So they thought they had the right to be given priority. So we had a huge racial dispute there, because the Chinese immigrants were seen as cheap labor who were stealing jobs from the Irish. However, that's not the case for Europeans today. The dissatisfaction that has led to increasingly larger and more violent protests in England, and that will spread to other countries sooner or later. At least it's not because these immigrants are stealing, but because the number of violent crimes has skyrocketed. And also because, especially in the Islamic case, the community now imposes Islamic laws on the native population. And add to these facts the issue that they receive a series of advantages and benefits that the natives never received. And they even make videos on social media, either celebrating such benefits that the natives don't have, or provoking the natives, or even announcing how they are. They are easily conquering the Europeans without having to fire a single shot, and the governments not only keep encouraging immigration, but also don't punish the immigrants when crimes are committed. And on top of that, they even punish the natives literally for complaining. Complaining about immigrants, or in quotes, blaspheming against Islam, is already, for some English politicians, a reason for imprisonment. Even memes have recently led to imprisonment for immigrants. Liberal democracies are growing less democratic and less liberal as media and governments criminalize and radicalize discourse against complaining natives. But everything's fine after all. They're fighting against Putin's dictatorship over there in Ukraine. So, understand that Europe, as we knew it in that utopian past, is over. And you have to be really naive to think otherwise, because let's look at the options. First, maintain the status quo and be honest with yourself and others. Can you imagine the African and Islamic communities in Europe becoming more westernized? Even many of the immigrants. But many already reach Europe expressing hate toward Europeans. And they make it clear that it's Europe that should adapt to them, not the other way around. The second option would be mass deportation. And here there are a number of problems, but two are the main ones. The first one is to locate all the illegal non-natives and those who are legal, but what to do with them? Deport them too? And the second problem is that we would be talking about mass deportation in volumes never seen before. Some might even say that, okay, Europeans could do this if they elect a candidate who promises to do it, but here it would also create two other problems. So notice that this second option has two problems, and each of these problems leads to other problems. So you can understand why the European dilemma is so hard to solve. It's huge. Do you understand this complexity? But suppose they somehow deport everyone in large numbers. Where are they going to send these immigrants? Because the so-called refugees destroy their documentation precisely so they can't be deported. So, we're saying that some country in North Africa or the Middle East would have to take in this mass of people. And obviously none of these countries want that. So what do? Because another thing about this, because to carry out this mass deportation, the Europeans would have to, this is important, do you understand? They would have to give up a series of democratic legal imperatives, especially respect for human rights. Because many of the refugees, in order not to be deported, claim political persecution or that they are fleeing from war. And by doing this legally, Europeans can't simply deport them back. Because in theory, it would be a death sentence. A sentence in theory, because obviously most of them are not at that risk. They migrated only for economic reasons. But in any case, the only way to make that choice would be for Europeans to be less democratic and openly admit it. And I can't imagine a fourth option, because otherwise racial and religious war will fall upon the Europeans, or the Europeans will have to abandon their image of democracy, or both things will happen together, which is the third option in the English case. I had already mentioned in a previous video a few years ago that England would probably be, in the future, the most totalitarian European state. And I'm surprised at how quickly this is happening. The English people of the 21st century are understanding why the American colonists back in the 18th century wanted to break free from the British crown. England has always flirted with authoritarianism. This isn't new. What held it back was its average citizen. When we talk about the average Englishman, what comes to many people's minds is the elegant, eloquent, refined, and well-dressed guy. But that's not even close to what the middle or lower class man in England is like. The average Englishman is rude, rough, coarse, a heavy drinker, and very Christian. And trust me, that's much more of a quality than a flaw in a certain sense. This average Englishman, in many ways, resembles the controversial Pole or the Russian, and it's no coincidence that these are the most prominent countries. With the hooligan groups, these guys truly represent the average Englishman, not some guy in a suit and tie speaking eloquently. London, Manchester, and Birmingham had gangs and organized crime issues long before immigrants arrived. But it was among them, between natives with natives, and even so, the crimes weren't as violent as the ones these gangs related to immigrants brought to them. They were never a perfect example of urban safety, but it was never at such a large, radical, and fierce level as was brought by these immigrants. But this average English citizen has always been used to this lack of niceties, so to speak, and that's why subduing this guy is difficult. It has always been difficult. The English state, despite its totalitarian aims, has always struggled to impose itself, precisely because of this population which simply fought back, struck back even unarmed, and confronted the authorities. But the arrival of immigrants changed this equation, because it has weakened the political power of the so-called average English hooligan and the English state. It has acted with the authoritarianism I mentioned before, to the point of announcing the early release of criminals, to make room for future protest party members who may be imprisoned. For opinion, then, it is becoming the perfect recipe for this old ambition of the English state. Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore and practically the father of the city-state, regarded by Kissinger as one of the greatest leaders of the century. That's not an exaggeration. He once said, "As in multiracial societies, you no longer vote according to your economic and social interests. You vote according to, and you have to do this people, you have to do this, authoritarian." So, by that logic, this demographic change will greatly benefit the English leadership actually, not just the English but the British, in controlling the states. It's the art of divide and conquer, plus new technologies and partnerships with big tech companies. For the first time in history, it's possible that the English authoritarians could actually take over the monopoly of power in the British Isles, diluting the average English citizen. And we'll see similar versions of this in almost every European country, at least in the case of Western Europe. I can see this in Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, and Belgium, but not so much with Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden. Not because they will still keep their democracy, they definitely won't, but because they'll probably be a version very similar to what Lebanon is today. States that aren't democratic and lack the strength to fully control the population, as in the English case, but becoming cauldrons of Islamic fury, organized gangs, urban and rural violence, and with racial, cultural, and religious tensions. We will most likely see a mix of Latinization and Lebanonization in these countries, meaning crime similar to that in Latin America, along with religious conflicts like in Lebanon. The main thing is to defeat the dictatorships of Putin and Xi Jinping. Everyone has their own priorities. Which reminds me how. But how come we have so many dishonest people who now blame Russia for this immigration crisis? Ignoring properly proven, documented, and recorded factors that the ones who determined the entry of that volume of human mass were Merkel in Germany, Sarkozy and Macron in France, and Cameron and Gordon in England. It's easier to blame others than to see your own failures. Anyway, the European utopia is over. They'll realize the truth too late and painfully. So, the big question which we still don't know how to answer is how these European and British elites will deal with the rise of other elites. As time goes by, it's too soon to imagine, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view. That's normal. What's some reminds me? What reminds me? Fiber. I got the Nakata and he never wants your best. And that's why they should avoid the trap of mass immigration, because far from saving Europe, that's exactly what will kill it as we know it. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to share the video with everyone you know. To help the Geopolitica Mundial channel keep growing and bringing this kind of information to you, your support helps a lot. Hugs, see you next video. Bye.